My husband's mistress stood on my doorstep, smirking as if she owned the place. "We're moving into this house. Pack your bags," she sneered, her words slicing through me like a blade. For a moment, I felt the old sting of humiliation, the kind of pain Marcus had fed me for years. Control, betrayal, lies disguised as love. But this time, I didn't flinch. I smiled wider, sharper, because Sophie had no idea what was waiting behind me. My lawyer stepped forward into the light, holding the folder that would shatter their little fantasy into dust. People used to envy me. At 33, I was an architect with projects featured in glossy magazines, a steady career I had built with my own hands, and a husband who, on the surface, seemed like every woman's dream. Marcus wore his charm like a tailored suit, smooth, polished, perfectly fitted for public display. Together we lived in a house everyone called the Hayes Gem, a beautiful colonial-style home perched on a quiet suburban street. To outsiders, we were the portrait of success, the ambitious wife, and the accomplished husband. But portraits, I would later learn, are just paint on a canvas. They can be cracked, hollow, and utterly false beneath the varnish. The cracks began small. Marcus insisted on handling our finances, claiming it was more efficient, since he had an eye for numbers. At first, I believed him. It seemed harmless, even considerate. But slowly, I noticed the shift. My paycheck was deposited into the joint account, yet he always decided how it was spent. If I wanted something, a new sketching tablet, a short trip to see an old college friend, he would tilt his head and say, "Do we really need that right now? I just don't think it's a wise investment." It sounded like concern, but felt like control. His words carried a weight that chipped at my confidence. When I wore a new dress to a dinner party, he smiled and said, "That color doesn't flatter you, but I guess it's fine." When I presented a design I was proud of, he leaned over my shoulder and murmured, "You tend to overcomplicate things, Clara. Clients like simple. Maybe tone it down next time." To anyone else, these were minor remarks. To me, they stacked up brick by brick, building a cage around my sense of self. Worse, he began to subtly pull me away from the people who once anchored me. He always had an excuse when I wanted to visit my sister. Traffic, late meetings, fatigue. Friends' invitations slipped through the cracks because he forgot to pass them along. "We need time together," he would remind me, his voice honeyed, his hand on mine. It sounded sweet, but it left me alone, cut off, and increasingly dependent on him. I questioned myself constantly. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was too sensitive, too easily bruised. Maybe my career had made me arrogant, blind to my own flaws. Gaslighting works like that. Slow, insidious, invisible until it coils around your throat. And I let it, because I believed in us, in the man I thought I had married. But one evening, while Marcus was in the shower, his phone lit up on the nightstand. I told myself I wouldn't look. I wasn't that kind of wife. Yet something tugged at me, a quiet, gnawing instinct that refused to let go. I picked it up. What I found shattered me and clarified everything all at once. A string of messages from someone named Sophie, not just flirtations, but plans, dinner dates I never knew about, hotel receipts forwarded to his email, photos, smiling, intimate, shameless. And then, worse than all of it, a bank transfer. Marcus had moved money from our joint account into another one labeled under Sophie's name. My money, my labor, my trust, funneled directly into the life of another woman. My hands trembled as I scrolled, my breath catching in my throat. For years I had felt the ground beneath me shifting, but now I saw the sinkhole for what it was. Marcus wasn't just betraying me with another woman. He was financing his betrayal with the very wages I worked for, the hours I spent hunched over blueprints, the nights I lost to deadlines. Shock hit me first, a cold punch that left me hollow. Then anger, raw and electric, surged through me, filling the hollow space like fire rushing into oxygen. And after the fire came something stranger, relief. Because finally, I wasn't imagining things. The whispers in my head that said, "Something is wrong," they were right all along. I had proof. I closed the phone carefully, slid it back onto the nightstand, and stood in front of the mirror. My face looked pale, tired, older than I remembered. But my eyes, they were different. They were awake. For years, Marcus had played a game I didn't know I was part of. He thought he could manipulate me, keep me small, feed me lies while he built a secret life on my back. That night, I made a decision. If Marcus wanted a game, he was going to get one. But it wouldn't be the game he thought he was playing, because I was no longer a piece on his board. I was going to become the one moving the pieces. I whispered to my reflection, steady, deliberate. If he wants to play dirty, I'll become the player he never saw coming. And deep down, I knew. Those faint cracks in the portrait of our marriage weren't flaws to patch. They were fractures widening into a storm. I didn't know yet how brutal the storm would be, but I was done pretending the sky was clear. The night I discovered Marcus's betrayal was the night I quietly redrew the blueprint of my life. If he thought I would storm into the living room, screaming and demanding explanations, he didn't know me at all. Rage might have been my first instinct, but reason came quickly after. If I exploded now, he would bury the evidence, twist the story, and make me the madwoman in his narrative. No, this battle would be fought in silence, and silence, when sharpened, could be deadly. I began by studying. I stayed up long after Marcus went to bed, the glow of my laptop hidden behind the cover of architectural drafts. But I wasn't designing buildings anymore. I was learning the architecture of law. I read articles about divorce, property division, admissible evidence. I learned which states allowed secret recordings, what kind of proof held up in court, and how to keep digital files secure. It felt like learning a new profession, one where my survival depended on precision. The first time I attempted to collect evidence, my hands shook so hard I nearly dropped the phone. Marcus had left his laptop open while he stepped outside to take a call. My heartbeat thundered as I slid into the chair and opened his email. Hotel receipts, wire transfers, dinner confirmations, it was all there. But just as I reached for the external drive to copy them, I heard the door creak. He was coming back. My pulse spiked. My mouth went dry. Without thinking, I pulled up Netflix, hit play on a random show, and sat back in the chair just as he walked in. He looked at me curiously. Couldn't sleep? I forced a smile, though sweat beaded at my temple. Just needed something mindless to watch. He kissed my head, oblivious, and walked away. The moment he left, my knees nearly buckled from relief. Adrenaline roared through me, but beneath the panic was something stronger. Resolve. That brush with discovery had lit a fire in me. Every night afterward, I became more careful. I installed hidden folders on an encrypted drive, learned how to back up files to a cloud account under a false name, and even practiced recording conversations without raising suspicion. With each screenshot, each bank transfer I documented, I felt less like a victim and more like a hunter stringing her bow. Still, the isolation was crushing. I needed allies. The first person I turned to was a lawyer I had been quietly referred to by a colleague. Her name was Evelyn Blake, sharp eyes, sharper mind, and the kind of presence that filled a room with unshakable confidence. In her office, I laid out my suspicions, sliding across the evidence I had so far. She scanned through the documents, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You have more than suspicions," she said. "You have a case, but you need to keep collecting. Do not tip your hand until you're ready. He will sense it if you move too soon." Her words became my new mantra. Do not tip your hand. Not long after, another unexpected ally stepped into my life. Rachel, a college friend I thought I had lost years ago after a bitter falling out, called me out of the blue. At first, I was wary. She had sided with Marcus once during an argument, and I had never forgiven her. But as we spoke, the truth surfaced. Rachel had seen Marcus with Sophie long before I had. She had tried to warn me, but Marcus intercepted her messages, twisting her words to make me distrust her. All this time, she hadn't abandoned me. She had been waiting for me to open my eyes. "I've kept notes," she confessed, her voice thick with regret. "Times, places, even photos. I thought you'd never believe me, but I couldn't let you walk blind forever." Her revelation hit me like another crack in Marcus's carefully painted mask. The man I lived with hadn't just betrayed me physically and financially, he had manipulated me into distrusting the people who loved me. It was both infuriating and liberating. Infuriating because I had let it happen. Liberating because I was no longer alone. With Evelyn and Rachel beside me, the web I spun grew tighter. Evelyn guided me through financial maneuvers, helping me discreetly open a new bank account. I began transferring small amounts from my personal side jobs, design consultations Marcus didn't know about, into that account. It was barely noticeable against the tide of expenses, but to me, every dollar was a brick in my escape route. Meanwhile, Rachel funneled information. She tracked Sophie's social media, caught Marcus in lies, and even managed to photograph him leaving Sophie's apartment. Every detail she provided became another nail for the coffin I was building. I was no longer the woman waiting to be crushed under Marcus's decisions. Every step, every secret, every calculated move shifted me closer to control. The cage he built around me had cracks, and through those cracks, I was climbing out. One night, after copying another set of incriminating files, I leaned back in my chair, the hum of the computer filling the silence. My heart was steady now. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it had hardened into something else. Determination. I realized as I tucked the drive into its hiding spot that each piece of evidence wasn't just proof. It was ammunition, and I was building an arsenal. I whispered into the darkness, steady and cold. Every file I hide is a bullet I'll fire back at him. Patience was the hardest mask to wear. Every morning I woke up beside Marcus, my body tense with the urge to scream at him, to throw his lies in his face. The evidence I had gathered sat like a live wire in my chest, buzzing, demanding release. But Evelyn's words repeated in my mind like scripture, "Do not tip your hand." So I smiled when he kissed my cheek. I nodded when he told me he'd be late at work. I laughed, hollow and rehearsed, when he cracked his tired jokes. I became an actress in my own home, playing the role of dutiful wife while my heart pulsed with silent fury. The duality was exhausting. At night, when Marcus was asleep, I would sit in the bathroom, the water from the faucet running to mask my quiet sobs. It wasn't just rage, it was grief. Grief for the years I had wasted, the love I had poured into a man who saw me as nothing more than a resource to exploit. But after the tears dried, resolve settled in again, cold and solid. The act had to continue. Every day I endured was another day I gained leverage. I learned to bury my emotions under layers of composure. At dinner, while Marcus droned on about work, I trained myself to observe instead of react. I noticed the way he checked his phone under the table, the smug twitch of his lips when he thought I wasn't looking. I saw the overconfidence in his stride, the certainty that I was blind. Every little detail became data, each habit another thread in the net I was weaving around him. The more I observed, the more I realized his arrogance blinded him. He no longer even tried to hide. Calls taken in the next room, credit card charges slipping into the statements with barely a cover story, whispers on the phone when he thought I was asleep. He had convinced himself I was too naive, too dependent to question. And in that blindness, he grew sloppy. One evening, as I worked late in my home office, I heard Marcus on the phone in the kitchen. His voice was low but urgent, the kind of tone he used when he wanted something badly. I muted my laptop and leaned closer to the door. "Yes, I'll handle it soon," he said. "She won't resist. Once the deed is transferred, it'll all be ours. She has no idea." My breath hitched. Deed. Transferred. He was talking about the house. Our house. My house. The one we had bought with both of our incomes. The one where I had spent countless nights sketching designs at the kitchen table. The one filled with memories he now planned to hand over to Sophie. For a moment, fury threatened to overwhelm me. The thought of Sophie walking through the halls I had built a life in, smug and victorious, nearly drove me out of the room with a scream. But I clenched my fists and forced myself still. This was more than betrayal. This was the proof Evelyn had told me to wait for, the kind of greed that courts despised. I began documenting everything with renewed focus: dates, times, overheard conversations. I even left a recorder running in my office one night, catching his entire conversation about the deed. The moment I played it back, hearing his voice promising Sophie ownership of something he had no right to give, a strange calm settled over me. Marcus wasn't just betraying me. He was handing me the rope with which he'd hang himself. It was almost poetic the way his greed consumed him. He thought himself clever, orchestrating a transfer that would leave me homeless and humiliated. But he didn't realize he was writing his own downfall. With every move he made, he dug his own grave deeper. At dinner the next night, he poured me a glass of wine, his expression smug, as if he held all the power. I lifted my glass and smiled back, matching his arrogance with serenity. Inside, though, I repeated the truth to myself like a vow. He believed I was still a pawn, but I had already stepped into the role of queen. And queens don't bow, they strike. I let out a soft laugh, one that made him glance at me with mild suspicion. "What's funny?" he asked. I shook my head, swirling the wine in my glass. "Nothing," I said, my smile unwavering. The truth was, it wasn't nothing. It was everything, because at that moment I realized he had no idea how close he was to collapse. I learned to smile at the table, even when the betrayer sat across from me. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, Marcus thought himself wise, but greed was always a man's true weakness. His would be no exception. It happened on a Saturday morning, bright and deceptively calm. I was sipping coffee by the window when I heard the knock, sharp, impatient, the kind of knock meant to assert dominance. My stomach tightened, but my face remained composed. I had been waiting for this moment. When I opened the door, Sophie stood there in a tailored coat. Her lips painted a smug crimson. Behind her, a sleek black car idled at the curb. She didn't waste time with greetings. Instead, she stepped forward, heels clicking against the porch, and announced, "We're moving into this house. Pack your bags." Her words hung in the air like a slap. For a fraction of a second, I imagined the reaction she expected. Me crumbling, pleading, maybe even crying. But instead, laughter bubbled in my chest. I didn't fight it. I let it rise. My smile widened into something sharp enough to cut glass. Sophie faltered. Just for a heartbeat, I saw it, the flicker of unease in her eyes. Predators don't expect prey to laugh. I leaned against the doorframe, tilting my head. "Welcome home," I murmured. My tone was light, but beneath it lay steel. Behind me, footsteps approached. Evelyn stepped into view, her presence filling the doorway. She carried a leather folder tucked under one arm, her expression calm and ruthless. Sophie's painted smile faltered further. "What's this?" Marcus's voice rang out from behind Sophie. He appeared on the walkway, his tie loosened, his face flushed with irritation. When he saw Evelyn, he froze. Evelyn opened the folder with practiced precision. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice carrying authority that brooked no argument, "consider yourself served." She handed over the papers: petition for divorce, restraining orders, and most importantly, the court order freezing all joint assets. Marcus snatched the papers, his hands trembling. "What the hell is this, Clara?" His voice cracked between rage and disbelief. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. "It's called consequences," I said evenly. "Something you've been avoiding for a very long time." Sophie's confidence evaporated as Evelyn slid another document across. "And as for you," she said coolly, "any further attempts to occupy this property will be considered trespassing. My client owns 50% of this house outright. Until legal proceedings are settled, you have no claim here." Sophie's face flushed scarlet. "This is ridiculous," she started, but Marcus cut her off with a snarl. He flipped through the papers, his eyes widening as he read the list of evidence: emails, bank transfers, recordings. Every betrayal cataloged, numbered, undeniable. "You were spying on me?" he demanded, his voice rising. I set the coffee cup down on the porch rail, steady as a surgeon. "No," I said softly. "I was paying attention. Something you should have done before you underestimated me." For the first time in months, the balance of power shifted tangibly. Marcus's shoulders sagged under the weight of the documents in his hands. Sophie glanced between us, realization dawning that she was standing on the wrong battlefield, fighting for a man already cornered. But I didn't stop there. Evelyn pulled out the pièce de résistance, a motion to block the deed transfer Marcus had attempted. The order declared any changes to property ownership null until the divorce case resolved. Marcus's mouth fell open. How did you— Because, Evelyn interrupted, her tone razor sharp. Your greed made you careless. Every signature, every wire transfer, every whispered phone call, Clara has it all. Silence followed. Even the birds outside seemed to pause, as if the world itself were bearing witness. I studied Marcus, noting the panic in his eyes. This wasn't the man who once boasted about control, who sneered at my sensitivity. This was a man unraveling. And Sophie? Her smirk had vanished entirely, replaced with the hollow look of someone who realized she had bet on a sinking ship. I let the silence stretch, savoring it, before I spoke again. You thought you could take everything from me, my money, my home, my dignity, but you forgot who designed the foundation you were standing on. You can't destroy the architect without collapsing the house. Marcus's jaw clenched, his knuckles white around the papers. He looked like he wanted to scream, to lash out, but Evelyn's presence was an immovable wall. I stepped back into the doorway, my smile unwavering. This is just the beginning, I told him, my voice low, final. Evelyn closed her folder with a snap, signaling the end of the confrontation. Sophie shifted awkwardly, her confidence shattered, and Marcus stood frozen, cornered in the trap he had so carefully laid for me. As I closed the door in their stunned faces, I felt no guilt, no hesitation, only a cold, steady calm. Because this wasn't revenge, this was reclamation, and this was only the opening move. Marcus didn't disappear into silence after Evelyn handed him those papers. He retaliated. Hard. Within days, whispers began circling among colleagues, neighbors, even friends I hadn't spoken to in months. Clara's unstable, they said. She's been paranoid for years. Marcus painted me as hysterical, a woman unraveling under the weight of her imagination. He told people I fabricated evidence, that my architecture deadlines had driven me half-mad, that my accusations were born from insecurity and delusion. Worse, he weaponized family. My mother-in-law called me late one evening, her voice sharp, brimming with rehearsed outrage. Marcus says you've lost your mind, Clara. He's worried about you. Divorce? Freezing accounts? What on earth are you doing? Behind her words was the unmistakable subtext. Fall back in line or face exile. His siblings joined the chorus, sending carefully worded texts about preserving the family name. To them, I was the villain threatening their reputation. The weight pressed down until I could barely breathe. I had built such a careful facade, but the cracks in my armor were real. One night, I locked myself in the bathroom, sitting on the cold tile floor, sobbing into my hands. My chest heaved with shame and fury. For a moment, I questioned everything. Was I the monster they claimed? Had I really become cold, calculating, vindictive? But as the tears slowed, I realized something piercing. Weakness didn't make me wrong. It made me human. I wasn't a machine of vengeance. I was a woman betrayed, fighting to survive, and in those quiet, raw minutes, I felt a new kind of strength crystallize. Not the brittle strength of anger, but the enduring strength of resolve. I wiped my face, stood before the mirror, and whispered to myself, "They want me broken. They want me quiet. But they'll never have that." My reflection looked back at me, weary but unyielding. For the first time, I believed it. Marcus thought his campaign of slander would drown me, but it only sharpened my focus. The time had come to fire the first real shot. I turned to Evelyn and Rachel, and together we unveiled what I had been saving. The recordings. In one, Marcus's voice was clear, unmistakable. Once the deed is in Sophie's name, Clara won't have a leg to stand on. She'll have to leave. She's too naive to catch on. The smugness in his tone was damning. In another, he admitted funneling money from our joint account into Sophie's. The words were a noose he had tied with his own arrogance. Evelyn wasted no time. She filed the evidence, presented it in court motions, and leaked carefully chosen excerpts to the press. Within a week, headlines screamed, "Prominent businessman caught in property scheme against wife." My inbox flooded with messages, journalists asking for comments, acquaintances offering support, strangers thanking me for exposing him. The narrative had shifted. I was no longer the paranoid wife. I was the woman standing against a con man. Marcus flailed. He held frantic meetings with his lawyer, tried to issue statements of denial, accused me of editing recordings. But the public wasn't fooled. The audio was too crisp, too detailed, too real. And then came the twist I never expected. His mother, my mother-in-law, the woman who had scolded me, dismissed me, treated me as an interloper, called me again. This time, her voice was different, shaken. "Clara, I didn't know. He told me lies. He's been lying to all of us." She gave a statement to the press, denouncing Marcus's actions, admitting she had once believed him but could no longer ignore the evidence. When his own mother turned against him, the last vestige of his credibility crumbled. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to strike. I only had to stand, let the truth speak for itself, and watch as Marcus unraveled. Sitting in my office, watching the news play footage of Evelyn walking out of court with her head high, I felt a strange sense of calm. Marcus had once been the center of my universe, dictating every detail of my life. Now, he was nothing more than a headline, a cautionary tale. I leaned back in my chair, whispering into the quiet room, "I don't need to destroy you. You're doing that all on your own." The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and disinfectant, a sterile stage for the chaos of human lives. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Evelyn, my palms pressed flat against the cool surface to steady the tremor in my hands. Across the aisle, Marcus sat with his attorney, his once proud posture now slouched, eyes darting from the papers in front of him to the doors at the back as though he were waiting for some miracle rescue. Sophie was there too, perched beside him in a fitted dress, her expression painted with the same arrogance she had carried to my doorstep weeks ago. But beneath her eyeliner, I caught the tremor in her jaw. The judge entered, the gavel fell, and suddenly the air tightened. Testimonies had already been delivered, bank records and audio recordings already dissected. But today was different. Today, Evelyn would present the final piece, the evidence Marcus could not slither away from. "Your Honor," Evelyn began, her voice steady as steel, "we have one last exhibit." She clicked a button on the laptop and the screen behind the bench flickered to life. Grainy at first, then clear. Marcus and Sophie sitting together at a cafe, leaning close, their voices captured by the discreet microphone Rachel had planted. Marcus's voice filled the room, smug and unguarded. "Once the deed is in your name, Clara won't have any ground left. We'll push her out. The house will be ours, the money secured. She'll have no choice but to leave quietly." The courtroom seemed to inhale as one. Sophie's recorded laugh followed, high and sharp. "She's too blind to fight you. By the time she realizes, we'll be long gone." The silence that followed the playback was absolute, broken only by the scratching of the court reporter's keys. Marcus's face drained of color. Sophie shifted uncomfortably, biting her lip. The judge's gaze, cool and piercing, locked on Marcus. "Mr. Hayes," the judge said, his tone laced with disapproval. "Do you deny this is your voice?" Marcus stammered, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. It's been taken out of context. She set me up." Evelyn rose again, unfazed. "Taken out of context, Your Honor? This is a direct admission of intent to defraud and dispossess my client. Along with the financial records and prior audio, it forms a pattern not of misunderstanding, but of premeditated deceit." I watched Marcus unravel. His hands clenched into fists, his face mottled with anger. But behind his fury was something more fragile, fear. Sophie, sensing the shift in the tide, slowly inched her chair away from him. When Marcus turned, as if expecting her loyalty, she wouldn't meet his eyes. The judge raised the gavel once more. The evidence is clear. Property transfer motions are void. Assets remain frozen until equitable division. Petition for divorce is granted in favor of the plaintiff. Custody of shared property is awarded to Mrs. Hayes. The crack of the gavel rang out like thunder, final and irrevocable. Relief surged through me so quickly it felt like my body might collapse under its weight. Evelyn squeezed my hand once, grounding me, while across the aisle Marcus sagged forward, defeated. Sophie stood abruptly, gathering her purse, muttering under her breath as she left the courtroom without so much as a glance at him. When the doors closed behind her, Marcus was truly alone. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. The audience of strangers who had filled the benches, curious neighbors, journalists, silent supporters, shifted, murmurs rippling through them. The narrative had turned. No longer was I the paranoid wife. I was the woman who fought back and won. When the judge adjourned, I stood tall, spine straight, head high. The storm had broken, and I was still standing. When the gavel struck, I whispered to myself as I stepped out of the courtroom, I knew the game was over. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, signatures, and official declarations. But beneath the bureaucracy lay something radiant, freedom. The house was mine. My finances were secure. My name was cleared. And more than that, the shadow Marcus had cast over me for years finally dissolved. Still, victory felt hollow if it ended with just me. As I walked through the familiar rooms of my reclaimed home, I thought of the countless women still trapped in marriages like mine. Gaslit, controlled, silenced. I remembered the nights I cried into my hands, convinced I was crazy, alone. That memory became the seed of something larger. Within weeks, I began drafting plans for a foundation, the Hayes Initiative, though not in honor of him, but in defiance of him. A fund to provide legal aid and counseling for women manipulated and abused in silence. Evelyn joined as an advisor, Rachel as a partner. What began as survival grew into purpose. There were still nights when loneliness crept in, when I sat by the window and wondered if I had wasted too many years on Marcus, if love would ever find me again. But those nights didn't break me. They steadied me. They reminded me of the price of freedom and the strength it demanded. One evening, months after the trial, I sat in the living room with the lights off. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that once would have terrified me, but now felt sacred. I curled my hands around a cup of tea, breathing in the silence, feeling the solidity of the walls I had fought so hard to keep. For the first time, I didn't feel like a warrior standing guard. I felt like a woman at peace. The past hadn't turned me into a cold avenger. It had remade me into someone who knew her worth, who could cry without shame, laugh without fear, and live without chains. I thought back to that morning on the porch, Sophie's smug declaration echoing in my ears. "We're moving into this house." And I smiled. They hadn't moved in. They had been moved out, by their own greed, their own arrogance. I glanced around my home, sunlight spilling across the hardwood floors, and let out a breath that was half laugh, half sigh. "This house," I murmured to the empty room, "is mine. My life is mine. Not a battlefield anymore, but a sanctuary. Not a prison, but a rebirth." And with that thought, I leaned back into the quiet, the corners of my lips curling into a smile that was no longer sharp or cold, but calm. I had walked through hell and come home to heaven.